I mean, you've spoken about it before. You've been on the face or a victim of racist hatred on more occasions than obviously more than one occasion is bad, more than zero occasions is bad even. So I imagine the Hate Crime Act is quite a personal piece of legislation for you. Some people would argue that it's justified. Others, in the last few days, and when it was making its way through Parliament, has suggested that it could have a chilling effect on free speech and lead to vexatious complaints. Do you understand why people are concerned about the Act?
Look, I don't dismiss people's concerns around freedom of expression. I think they're important in any society, that we have the freedom to insult, the freedom to offend, the freedom to criticise, particularly when it comes to governments. We should be on the receiving end of, whether it's people have every right to give us criticism and insult and satire. So these things absolutely should be protected. That's why, of course, the Hate Crime Bill has freedom of expression protections built within it. I mean, literally on the face of the bill, explicitly, is protections around freedom of expression, let alone the reasonable person defence, let alone the fact, of course, all of our legislation has to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. In terms of it being personal, and you've made the point that obviously I've been a victim of racial and religious hatred over the years. I think for me, I look at the protections I have as a person of colour, and there has been a stirring up offence in relation to racial hatred for most of my life. I was born in 1985, and that offence has existed since 1986, with almost zero controversy. And the threshold is actually lower than the threshold that we're proposing. That's in the Hate Crime Act. So for me, I think as a person of colour, well, if I've got that protection in terms of my race, then why should somebody not have it because of their religion, their disability, their sexuality, and so on and so forth? In terms of, as I say, freedom of expression, I worked hard with a number of groups, including, of course, with opposition MPs. And I would give an example of, Professor Adam Tompkins, no longer MSP, was an MSP, of course, previously Professor of Public Law at Glasgow University. Worked closely with Adam to make sure that we had those freedom of expression safeguards within the bill. So I don't agree with anybody that there'll be a chilling effect. I don't think there will be. I think this bill will come into force. It will do the job it's meant to do. And frankly, much like other pieces of legislation where there's a lot of political and opposition interest, people will move on. And I have to say, having knocked the doors in Greenock over the weekend, a grand total of 0 people raised the Hate Crime Act with me, and very few people do on the doorstep.
I mean, you mentioned Adam Tompkins. He also warned that police would end up, quote, dealing with and dismissing ill-founded complaints made by people who are offended, upset, hurt or distressed by something someone else has said. That sounds like a waste of police time.
Police are really, I think, well-trained, adept at dealing with any complaints that might be vexatious or, frankly, are not going to meet the criminal threshold. And that's not unique to a hate crime act or hate crime more generally.
But a lot of those things are going to go down on a record as being hate crime incidents, even if they're not a crime. I mean, that's surely not fair. That's going to have an effect on what people do. They're going to self-police.
Just remember what the police have said today, that the hate crime incident isn't attached to an individual. The reason they record a hate crime incident, so if they believe there has been a hate crime incident that doesn't meet the threshold for criminality, it is important to be able to spot patterns of hate crime that might be taking place. So, for example, if there's a spike in anti-Semitism, spike in homophobia, really important for police to be able to see that level of, or any spike in hatred that might be happening but may not quite reach a level of a criminal threshold.
But I mean, Callum Steele, who you'll know, the former chair of the Police Federation, who look after the rank and file, said, I suspect that within a very short period of time we'll have data, in inverted commas, suggesting Scotland to be one of the most hateful countries on earth. I mean, surely that must worry you as a possibility, given that I don't think that's how you would describe Scotland.
It's definitely not how I would describe Scotland, but I also don't think Scotland is immune from hate, and therefore we've got to have legislation in place to protect people. And often we're talking about the most vulnerable and marginalised groups from hatred, and I'm not probably the only one in the world that worries about some of the discourse around marginalised communities. And it feels that as a society we're becoming more and more polarised globally. And we'll see how that plays out in many elections right across the world. And so it's really important to have a strong framework of legislation against hatred. So as I say, I've got every confidence in police's ability to make sure that they're dealing with complaints in the appropriate fashion. So those that meet the criminal threshold, investigating them, those that don't, dealing with them, and those that are just vexatious, then of course, as police do, I suspect on a daily basis, dealing with those vexatious complaints in an appropriate manner.
I mean, this could end up going the same way as the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. That's how a lot of people speak about it.
Absolutely won't. I mean, this is a robust piece of legislation.
You think it's better than that piece of legislation?
Much better than that piece of legislation. It is a robust piece of legislation. It has been scrutinised extensively. It has compromised from its original form to the final form in terms of the Act. It was, supported by every party bar the Conservatives, were the only ones who didn't. And maybe that's unsurprising, given, quite frankly, the Conservative Party of late have taken money from a racist misogynist, and as a party at a UK level, most certainly, I'm afraid a number of senior MPs have been involved in Islamophobic slurs and insinuations. So, the Conservative Party, as I said to Douglas Ross last week, should probably look to get their own party in order before they oppose the Hate Crime Act.